Press your hand flat against a wall right now or imagine doing it. Feel the shape of it, the specific curve of your fingers, the exact size that belongs to nobody else on Earth, a shape as unique to you as your own face. Now imagine doing that 40,000 years ago in the dark by torchlight on a cave wall in what's now Spain. Blowing red pigment through a hollow bone around your own outstretched fingers, pulling your hand away, and leaving something behind that no flood, no war, no forgotten language could ever erase. Someone did exactly that. Hundreds of times in hundreds of caves across tens of thousands of years, from France to Spain to Indonesia to Argentina, on nearly every continent humans ever reached. And for most of the last century, scientists got the story of who did it almost completely wrong. So who actually left these prints, and what were they even trying to say? For decades, the assumption barely got questioned. Cave walls covered in bison, horses, and mammoths sat right next to these handprints, and the logic seemed obvious. Men hunted those animals, men must have painted them. The handprints were filed under the same assumption, treated as a kind of signature left by hunters, maybe even a form of hunting magic meant to improve the odds of tomorrow's kill. It was a tidy story, and tidy stories tend to survive a long time in any field, simply because nobody feels the need to check something that already makes intuitive sense. In 2013, an archaeologist named Dean Snow decided to actually test that assumption instead of repeating it. Snow, working out of Pennsylvania State University, had spent years developing a method to determine the sex of a hand from its proportions alone, the relative length of the ring finger compared to the index finger, the overall size and width of the palm. The idea traced back to earlier research on modern hands showing that these ratios differ on average between men and women, subtly but measurably. Snow built an algorithm around those ratios, tested it against modern reference hands, and then applied it to 32 hand stencils found across 11 caves in France and Spain, sites including El Castillo, Gargas, and Pech Merle. The result overturned decades of assumption in a single paper. 3/4 of the handprints Snow found were female. There has been a male bias in the literature for a long time, Snow said afterward, adding that assumptions about who made this art and why had gone unquestioned for far too long. The image of the rugged Paleolithic hunter, alone in a cave marking his kills, quietly fell apart under the simple weight of measuring finger length. Sit with that for a second. For most of the 20th century, textbooks confidently described these images as the work of men. Nobody had actually measured a single handprint to check. An assumption about gender roles built entirely on what researchers expected to find stood unchallenged for generations, until someone finally thought to bring a ruler. How many other obvious facts about the deep past are still waiting for someone to actually check? And the handprints weren't only made by adult women either. Later research examining hundreds of stencils across multiple sites found that roughly 1/4 of them belonged to children, some small enough to suggest toddlers barely old enough to walk on their own, their tiny hands pressed against stone at a height that means someone almost certainly had to lift them up to reach it. Picture that scene instead of the lone hunter. Not a solitary man marking territory, but a shifting group, women, children, elders maybe, gathered together in torchlight, taking turns pressing their hands to stone, waiting for each person to have their moment against the wall before the next one stepped forward. That alone would be enough to rewrite this story. But the next discovery goes even further back, past the point where the story was supposed to even be possible. In 2018, and again with more detailed results in 2025, a research team led by geochemist Chris Standish used uranium-thorium dating, a technique that measures the radioactive decay of minerals that slowly form over a painting once it's made, to date hand stencils in Maltraviso Cave in Extremadura, Spain. The method works because groundwater seeping through limestone leaves behind thin layers of calcite on top of any painting beneath it, layer after layer, century after century, like sediment settling at the bottom of a lake. Measuring the uranium and thorium trapped in that mineral crust gives researchers a minimum age for whatever lies underneath it, without ever needing to damage the artwork itself. The results were almost impossible to believe at first. Some of the hand stencils in Maltraviso were at least 66,700 years old. Anatomically modern humans didn't reach that part of Europe until roughly 45,000 years ago. Do the math, and there's only one group of hands that could have made those prints: Neanderthals. For over a century, Neanderthals were dismissed as cognitively simple, incapable of anything resembling symbolic thought, let alone art. Textbooks well into the 20th century described them as a dead-end branch of evolution, closer to animal instinct than human imagination, a species that could survive but never truly create. This single finding, a hand pressed against stone tens of thousands of years before our own species ever walked into that cave, quietly demolished that assumption too. Whoever pressed their palm against that wall in Maltraviso wasn't scratching out a survival tool or marking a territory boundary. They were doing something with no practical use at all, something that served no purpose except perhaps to be seen, remembered, or simply felt. Now picture it. Not a modern human ancestor but someone else entirely, someone whose species would eventually disappear, standing in absolute darkness except for a small flickering flame carried in from outside. They mix ochre with water or spit, fill their mouth or a hollow reed with pigment and press their palm flat against cold stone. A short breath. A spray of red dust settling into the shape of a hand that will still be legible 66,000 years later, long after every person who ever knew their name, spoke their language, or remembered their face has vanished completely from the earth. Nobody knows exactly why they did it. Some researchers connect the handprints to rites of passage, a child's first hand marking their place among the group. Others see it as a kind of census, a record of everyone who was present, human and perhaps not quite human alike, on a particular night in a particular cave. Paul Pettit, an archaeologist at Durham University, has called hand stencils a truly ironic category of cave art, precisely because they feel so instantly familiar, yet resist real explanation the closer researchers actually look. Maybe that's exactly the point. A handprint doesn't need translation. It doesn't rely on a shared language, a shared culture, or even, as it turns out, a shared species. It only requires one thing, a hand and a wall and the simple, wordless impulse to say, in the most direct way physically possible, I was here. You've probably done a version of this yourself without ever connecting it to any of this. A handprint in wet cement outside a childhood home. A small painted palm on construction paper, still taped to someone's refrigerator or folded inside a box of old keepsakes. A child's hand pressed into clay at a school fair, fired and glazed and kept on a shelf for decades after that child has grown and moved away. The instinct never disappeared. It just moved from stone to paper, from ochre to poster paint, carried forward by every generation since, without anyone teaching it directly, without anyone needing to explain why it matters. Somewhere in a dark cave in Spain, 66,000 years before you were born, a hand pressed against rock and stayed. Not a hunter marking a kill, maybe a mother, maybe a child. Maybe, almost certainly, someone who was never meant to be remembered by name, who left no story, no grave marker, no descendants anyone could trace, but who is remembered anyway, every single time a human being presses a palm to something solid and leaves a mark that says, without a single word, I was here too.